Okay, hi. So this particular little few minutes is to try to give you an update on what's happening in the BRICS bloc, particularly following um, the summit that took place late summer this year. Don't forget, let's have a quick resume of what we mean by the BRICS bloc. It's Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. Originally, just the four without South Africa. The BRIC countries were more of a concept identified by Jim O'Neill at Goldman Sachs as early as 2001, where he spoke about how they could become dominant economies by 2050, and South Africa added to that due to its rapid growth, rapid economic growth. And in 2009, there was a first formal attempt to create some kind of trading bloc with these countries, with their rationale being that they could become a challenge to the established Western institutions from the Bretton Woods, such as the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, which have got a common criticism, which is that they're very Western-centric and not necessarily looking after the interests of economically developed countries. They were looking to foster economic cooperation and even try to develop political cooperation between themselves, where they could start to challenge, start to approach, some of the larger global challenges that we're going to start to develop in the 21st century, and have a more coordinated political stance on these and exert a new axis of influence, if you like. So, as well as the economic growth, they launched their own new development bank as a way to try to operate a structure outside of those existing Bretton Woods structures. And they looked for reform of global financial institutions at the same time, a reform of the IMF, reform of the World Bank, and the World Monetary Fund. And they're basically starting to move themselves forward, saying that there's got to be less of a North America, Euro centric view of the world and more a multi-polarity, and that there are other countries that are now in a position where they can exert that kind of influence. So let's take a look at a little bit more detail. Huge countries in terms of population. So to give you some idea of why the BRICS still exert this kind of impact, about 40% of the world's population, over 3 billion people, live within these BRICS countries. And they've got one of their strengths, if you like, is that there is a huge mixture of economies within there. So you can see breaking the economy down by primary, secondary, tertiary, primary being the exploitation of raw materials, secondary being manufacturing, tertiary being retail and services. You can see huge variations within the economy. Some would argue that's a strength, that they have those kind of differences. Some would argue that this is one of the weaknesses of the BRICS countries, that if you look at more traditional economic blocs such as the EU, one of the things they look for is economic convergence to add to the strength of the bloc. Whereas here we've got huge economic differences. To try and put these figures in context, for instance, France has got a primary sector around about 1.7% and a tertiary sector somewhere pushing, if not at 80. So you can see that there's huge variation there. China, India still got large primary and secondary sectors, whereas other countries such as Brazil and South Africa got large tertiary sectors, but all of them with primary sectors way exceeding what you would expect to find in a Western European country. For instance, we also have to look at this huge differentials in the size of their GDPs, and all trading blocks have this, but they're probably more marked in the BRICS than others. And it's not just the differences in the GDP. As you can see there, India's very low compared to Russia, for instance, a fraction less than a quarter of it. But also, if you start to look at some of the patterns in there, you can see some of the things that they were discussing at the recent BRICS conference. Russia's had a recent rise, but of course they're going to come under pressure from sanctions because of the conflict in Ukraine. You can see Brazil's downward trend, India's growth, which is continuing but relatively modest, China's growth, of which there's concerns that China's economy, after being a real kind of supercharged economy of the last 20 years, is starting to slow down a little. And South Africa also showing signs of some decline, particularly post-COVID. So not like many countries in the world at the minute, not a hugely rosy economic picture, but some concerns about stalling or declining economies, and also some concerns about the differences in the relative size of the economies, and therefore the dominance that one member can exert over another. However, they do have economic advantages. Got very young populations, very economically large bodies of economically active people. So labour force availability is good and is relatively youthful. You can see here debt as a share of external debt to GDP, which looks quite high for some countries. If you consider, though, that France is currently running around about 245%, they are relatively light on debt also. So countries with huge potential, countries with very mixed economies, trying to reorientate this global axis, of economic and political power. And at the same time, many of them arguably in positions where they could really vault forward very, very quickly. So the BRICS summit took place in South Africa on the 22nd to 24th of August. So what we need to look at is take on board all of the context of the BRIC countries, and start to look at what the conference was about. And the conference in some ways exacerbated some of the existing tensions that there are in the bloc, and brought to light some of the challenges that will face both the BRICS and other economies moving forward. Here were the main participants in the conference. Some issues around this. So Vladimir Putin, for instance, couldn't attend. The main tension here was that South Africa, which was the host country, are a member of the ICC, the International Criminal Court, and there's currently a warrant out for the arrest of Putin for war crimes in Ukraine. So if he stepped foot on South African soil, he would have to have been arrested by the South African authorities. So in there, we see one of the existing tensions that there are in BRICS, which is that many of the countries have got very different geopolitical agendas. And some of them have got contrary geopolitical agendas. India and China, for instance, have had border disputes within the same bloc. They still have disputes over China's dominance of Southeast Asia and its role in the South China Sea. So the geopolitical problems aren't just from the BRICS outwards, but they're within the BRICS. You can also see there Lula da Silva, the president of Brazil, who is a right wing. After much arguments and disruption at the polls, he took over as a very, very right wing president for Brazil, and people still aren't quite sure. The other BRICS countries aren't quite sure what that will mean for his stance. Will he maintain a more isolationist stance with the other countries? So there's quite a lot of tensions there with the people who came. President Xi Jinping didn't arrive at the conference at first. And that also was a bit of a blow for South Africa, who rely a lot on China. And some people were talking about whether China's domestic agenda was going to start to dominate and whether they will become less outward looking. But certainly one of the things that's caused issues in amongst the BRICS has been the increased military interventions that China is starting to make in and around the world. So different countries starting to have different kind of worldviews and seeing things very, very differently. So one of the major agreements that was made at the BRICS conference was that of expansion that's going to take place. So here on the map, you can see the current members in red, and the new members who are going to be in green. Those new members are going to be Argentina, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, and the United Arab Emirates. Very, very interesting array of countries. Argentina will, as you can see here, is a major producer of lithium, which is a critical metal for clean energy transition, and their entry into the BRICS bloc is seen as a great asset. It's also seen as dealing with what President Modi of India called the curse of distance for Brazil, where it will strengthen some of the trading relationships there. Ethiopia, again, a country where there's huge opportunities for major infrastructural projects that are taking place, another rapidly growing East African economy, and they already have very, very strong links with China. So that seemed like a natural move. Probably the most curious entrants are going to be Iran, the UAE, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, Iran, large oil economies. The UAE, through Abu Dhabi, having large gas reserves. So they will join Russia to form a kind of parallel bloc outside of OPEC, the oil and petroleum exporting countries, where they could also exert huge influence over global oil supply, global oil prices. But what's probably more interesting there is that Iran and Saudi Arabia and Egypt and the UAE have had very, very poor political relations, to say the least. And in fact, currently in the Yemenis civil war, you actually have Iran backing forces that are fighting against Saudi Arabian forces there. So again, these geopolitical tensions that exist in the BRIC countries are surfacing and rearing their heads with the new entrants. You can see where there's been applications for membership. And you can also see Belarus, obviously, with close relationships with Russia there. Indonesia raising a few eyebrows as another huge population and also another large oil exporting country, and some other countries in Africa, including, interestingly, the Democratic Republic of Congo. Another country with governance and infrastructural issues, but with huge natural reserves of enormous wealth. So the BRICS expansion was the main item on the agenda, and seeing this now as a group that will look to expand and grow and start to challenge the G7 and certainly the G20, the current loose alliances of largest economies on the planet, with some real added weight to their attempts to try to drag the political and economic access away from North America and Europe. What will it look like, the new grouping? So as you can see, certainly for certain factors, the new entrants into the BRICS group will have a very modest impact. So certainly in terms of GDP, a slight rise to 29% of global GDP within that bloc. Population, high population growth of countries like Ethiopia is going to mean that their population has an increasing effect and moving up now towards half of the global world's population. I think probably the biggest impact, as we touched upon earlier with Saudi Arabia, Iran, the UAE is going to be in oil production. Exports will continue to be dominated by China. So essentially, that's it for the BRICS conference. What we've got here is we've got a bloc that's going to be dominated for quite some time by expansionist ideals, but they are going to bring with them some tensions. So it's going to be a case of keeping a close eye on whether the BRICS group can overcome those tensions, whether being part of the group will mean that those tensions will be diluted and that there'll be an opportunity for countries such as Iran and Egypt and Iran and Saudi Arabia to work together, or whether the BRICS alliance is going to actually reduce in influence despite its size because of those internal and in the case of Russia, some of those external tensions that emerge. Okay, so thanks very much. Hope that's been interesting, and we'll see you soon for some more of these little geopolitical updates.